Medieval peasants lived on food we'd throw in the garbage today, and they were often healthier than us. One dish was literally made from weeds and pond scum. But here's the disturbing part. Historians think we should be eating some of these again. Why? Forget everything you think you know about bread. The fluffy white stuff we buy today? Medieval peasants would have traded a week's wages for a single slice. What they actually ate was maslin, a mongrel loaf. Whatever grains you had, you threw together. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, sometimes all four in one bread. Sounds terrible, right? Here's the thing, though. It was genius. Pure wheat failed your crop? You still had rye. Rye got a fungus? Barley pulled through. Mixing grains wasn't poverty cooking. It was medieval insurance. And these loaves were absolute units. We're talking 4 pounds each. That's heavier than a newborn baby. One loaf had to last an entire week, so bakers made them dense enough to survive. The coarse texture everyone complained about actually kept you fuller longer than the fancy white bread nobles ate. Sometimes the cheap option wins, but desperate times pushed bakers into dark territory. Sawdust, chalk, ground beans. Medieval food inspectors didn't mess around either. Get caught adulterating bread? Execution. That's one health code violation you don't appeal. My favorite part? Trenchers. Peasants sliced stale maslin bread flat and used it as plates. You'd pile your food on top, eat the meal, then eat your dish. Zero cleanup. No washing required. Honestly, I've had lazier Sundays with worse solutions. The bread that fed millions wasn't pretty. It wasn't soft, but it worked. And speaking of making things work with almost nothing, Stockfish was cod-dried in cold Nordic winds until it became hard as a wooden board. No salt needed. The Vikings figured this out over 1,000 years ago, and honestly, it might be their greatest invention after longships. Here's the wild part. This stuff stayed edible for 5 to 7 years. 5 to 7 years. I've got leftovers in my fridge that don't last 5 to 7 days. The secret was Norway's freezing coastal air. Fishermen hung cod on wooden racks and let nature do the work. The result was fish so hard you could literally use it as a weapon. Some records mention sailors defending ships with stockfish. Talk about dinner fighting back. But merchants loved it. Stockfish weighed almost nothing compared to salted fish, needed no expensive barrels, and traveled anywhere without spoiling. By the 1300s, Norway was shipping over 3,000 tons annually to hungry villages across Europe. Now, eating it, that required patience. Peasants soaked the rock-hard fish in water for days. Then came the fun part. They beat it with wooden mallets like they were tenderizing a grudge. Only then would the flesh soften enough to cook. And the smell during rehydration? Legendary. Some towns actually banned the practice near marketplaces. Imagine a stench so powerful it needed legislation. Yet landlocked peasants hundreds of miles from any ocean ate seafood because of this ugly, smelly, board-stiff fish. Speaking of simple ingredients with staying power, wheat took a different approach entirely. Fermenti might be the only medieval dish that showed up at both peasant hovels and royal banquets. Same basic recipe, cracked wheat boiled in milk or broth until it turned creamy and thick. That's it. But here's where things get interesting. At the king's table, saffron, almonds, egg yolks, and chunks of venison swimming in golden porridge. At the peasant's table, plain wheat with whatever animal fat hadn't gone rancid yet. Same dish, completely different experience. Kind of like how a burger at a fast food joint and a burger at a fancy steakhouse are technically the same food. Technically, the preparation had a trick to it. Wheat kernels were creed overnight, meaning they soaked until the tough outer hull softened. This saved precious firewood the next day. Fuel wasn't free, and peasants counted every stick. What really surprised me researching this? Fermenti dates back to Roman times. We're talking about a recipe that survived over 1,000 years of continuous use. Your great-great-great-grandmother times 100 probably ate this exact dish. Christmas and Easter brought the special versions. These were the 2 days peasants might taste something approaching luxury. A little honey, maybe some dried fruit if the harvest was good. And unlike the thin gruels that dominated most meals, proper Fermenti was thick enough to eat with a spoon. Small victory? Sure. But in a world of slurping from bowls, spoons meant dignity. Speaking of dignity, the next dish had absolutely none. The nursery rhyme wasn't making things up. Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. That was literal. Peasant families kept a pot of pea porridge bubbling on the fire for days straight, sometimes over a week. Every morning they'd throw in whatever they had: a handful of dried peas, some onion if they were lucky, maybe a bone with scraps still clinging to it. The pot never went empty. And here's the thing about dried peas. They were dirt cheap. We're talking a fraction of what meat or cheese cost. A single pot could feed a family of 6 for less than a penny per day during the worst famines. Try finding that deal anywhere today. But wait, wasn't this basically a bacteria party? Probably. The perpetual stew method meant layers of ingredients from different days all mingling together. Old peas meeting new peas, Tuesday's turnip shaking hands with Friday's mystery meat. Yet somehow, people survived. The constant heat killed most nasties, though I wouldn't recommend trying this at home. Yellow and green split peas stored for years without refrigeration. No fancy preservation needed. Just keep them dry. Even monks relied on peas porridge during Lent's 40-day meat ban. When you can't eat beef, pork, or chicken for over a month, suddenly that humble pot of peas looks pretty good. Now, if peas seem basic, wait until you hear what peasants did with pig blood. When peasants slaughtered a pig, they turned into efficiency machines. Nothing got wasted. Not the skin, not the organs, and definitely not the blood. Someone held a bucket under the animal while it bled out. Then the race began. Fresh blood spoils within hours, so families worked fast, seasoning it with whatever spices they could afford, mixing in oats or barley to stretch it further, then stuffing everything into the pig's own intestines. Sounds grim, right? But here's the thing. Blood contains almost as much protein as a steak. The iron content helped prevent anemia in people who rarely saw red meat on their plates. What looked like desperation food was actually genius nutrition. And this wasn't some medieval invention. Homer wrote about blood sausage in the Odyssey. That's 3,000 years of humans refusing to waste perfectly good protein. The dark color that makes some people squeamish, that's iron oxidizing, the same iron that kept peasant families from getting sick. My grandmother used to say her family ate blood sausage during hard winters in Eastern Europe. She called it survival food that actually tasted good. I tried it once. She wasn't wrong. The fillers were the clever part. Oats and breadcrumbs meant one pig's blood could feed more mouths. Poor families couldn't afford to be picky. They could only afford to be smart. But blood sausage was mostly a cold weather treat. When winter dragged on, peasants needed something else, something green. Cabbage doesn't sound exciting, I get it, but this humble vegetable was literally called the doctor of the poor across medieval Europe. Here's why that nickname mattered. When December hit and every green thing had died, cabbage just sat there in the frozen ground, perfectly fine. Frost actually made it sweeter. Peasants could walk outside in the dead of winter and harvest fresh food while their neighbors were gnawing on dried peas and stale bread. The vitamin C alone saved countless lives. Scurvy wasn't just a sailor problem. Anyone stuck eating only grains and dried meat through a long winter risked losing teeth and worse. Cabbage fixed that. But the real magic? Fermentation. Someone figured out that salting and packing cabbage created sauerkraut, which lasted for months without rotting. No refrigeration needed, just salt, thyme, and a good barrel. One harvest could feed a family until spring. Roman soldiers swore by cabbage before battle. They believed it prevented drunkenness and boosted courage. Probably didn't work for the hangover part, but the nutrition was real. And here's a fact that surprised me. 1 acre of cabbage produced more edible food than 1 acre of any grain crop. For a peasant with a tiny plot of land, that math changed everything. The sulfur compounds that make your kitchen smell terrible while cooking cabbage, those same chemicals provide the health benefits. Speaking of foods, the church basically required people to eat. Fish wasn't optional in medieval Europe, it was mandatory. The church banned meat on Fridays, Wednesdays, Saturdays, during Lent, and on countless holy days. Add it up, and you're looking at roughly 150 days per year where eating beef or pork could land you in serious spiritual trouble. So, what did peasants eat? Herring. Oceans of herring. These silver fish arrived in schools so massive that fishermen could practically scoop them out with baskets. No exaggeration. During peak runs, the water literally churned with them. Now here's where it gets practical. Peasants took salted herring, layered it with onions, and baked it into pies using the cheapest flour they could find. Nothing fancy, just survival in crust form. The salt that preserved those herring, worth its weight in, well, not gold, but close. Workers were sometimes paid in salt instead of coins. That's where the word salary comes from. Your paycheck has fish preservation to thank for its name. English fishing fleets pulled in billions of herring annually. Entire coastal towns existed because of the fall herring runs. Miss the season? Your whole economy collapsed. And the weird part is how families bought these fish. One barrel contained around 1,000 herring. Families purchased a single barrel and rationed it through the entire winter. That's a lot of fish pie. But herring wasn't the only protein-keeping laborers fed. The real heavy lifting came from something that built cathedrals. Bean pottage built Europe's most famous cathedrals, literally. Those laborers hauling stone blocks up Notre Dame's scaffolding, they weren't eating steak. They survived on thick bean stews day after day, year after year. And somehow, they had enough strength to construct buildings that still stand 800 years later. Here's what peasants figured out without any science. Beans plus bread equals complete protein. They had no clue about amino acids or nutrition charts. They just noticed that people who ate beans with their bread stayed stronger than people who didn't. Sometimes the body knows before the brain catches up. Fava beans dominated medieval gardens because they grew in terrible soil. Wheat failed, plant beans, the land exhausted. Beans actually put nutrients back into the dirt. It's like having a crop that feeds you and fixes your farm. Pretty clever for a humble legume. Now, working men needed around 4,000 calories daily for heavy labor. That's not a typo. Building walls, digging ditches, plowing fields, this burns energy like crazy. Bean pottage with bread could actually deliver those calories, barely, but it worked. The phrase, not worth a bean, tells you everything about medieval bean prices. Dirt cheap, available everywhere. The poor man's protein. And yes, the flatulence problem was real. Medieval joke books are full of crude humor about peasant diets. Some things never change. But beans weren't the only grain-keeping workers alive. Rye bread fed millions, and occasionally drove them mad. Rye was the stubborn grain. It grew where wheat threw a tantrum and died. Cold climates, soggy fields, terrible soil. Northern Europe and Russia would have starved without it. But here's where things get dark. Literally. Rye bread kept millions alive, yet it also killed thousands. The culprit? A fungus called ergot that infected the grain and turned it into poison. And not just any poison. Ergot caused hallucinations, violent convulsions, and a horrifying condition called St. Anthony's fire. Your limbs would turn black with gangrene and eventually fall off. Entire villages went mad at once, seeing demons, screaming at things that weren't there. Some historians think ergot poisoning sparked witch trial hysteria. Others believe mass religious visions were actually mass food poisoning. Makes you wonder what else we've blamed on the supernatural that was really just bad bread. The weird part? Peasants had no clue why it happened. They'd eat from the same grain supply, some would go crazy, others stayed fine. Must have seemed like divine punishment. When the rye wasn't contaminated, though, it was genuinely nutritious. More fiber than modern whole wheat. Kept everything moving, if you catch my drift. Russian peasants ate nearly 3 pounds of rye bread daily. 3 pounds. That single food provided 80% of their total calories. Their entire civilization ran on dark, dense loaves that could either sustain you or send you to an early grave. Speaking of dangerous foods, sometimes the crops failed entirely. Stinging nettles. Yes, those plants that attacked your ankles as a kid and left you with burning welts for hours. Peasants ate them on purpose. Here's the thing. When crops failed and grain stores emptied, those painful weeds became dinner. Nettles grew everywhere for free. Roadsides, forest edges, abandoned fields. You just needed gloves and courage. The cooking process destroyed the stinging chemicals completely. Heat breaks down those tiny needles that inject formic acid into your skin. What's left? A green that tastes remarkably like spinach. But here's what most people don't realize. Nettles contain more iron than spinach and more protein than most vegetables. A genuine superfood hiding in plain sight, disguised as something you'd normally avoid at all costs. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, nettle soup kept entire villages alive when everything else ran out. 3 years of relentless rain destroyed crops across Europe. Millions died. The ones who survived often did so by eating what grew wild, and gathering these plants was women's work. Mothers, grandmothers, daughters. They memorized which weeds were edible, which were poisonous, which ones appeared in spring versus fall. This knowledge passed down through generations wasn't written in books. It lived in their heads. One woman's foraging expertise could mean her entire family survived the winter. Nettles also made rope, fabric, and medicine. Peasants called it the plant of 100 uses. Speaking of multiple uses, some peasants turned one simple ingredient into an entire survival system. The English had a saying about oats, a grain fit only for horses. The Scots heard that insult and basically responded with, "Cool, we'll outlive you then." And they did. See, oats actually thrived in Scotland's rainy, miserable weather. Wheat? It rotted in the fields before harvest. Barley struggled. But oats loved the damp. They practically begged for more rain. So Scottish peasants turned this horse food into flat, dense cakes that became their entire food culture. Here's what made oat cakes brilliant for survival. You didn't need an oven, no expensive equipment, just a flat stone heated over a fire. The poorest family with nothing but a rock and some flames could make these. The energy release was slow and steady too. Farmers working 14-hour days in the fields didn't crash by noon. They kept going. Modern nutritionists would call this low glycemic index. Medieval Scots just called it not starving. Travelers loved them for different reasons. Oatcakes didn't spoil. They didn't crumble in your pack. You could carry enough for weeks without worrying about mold or rot. I've actually tried authentic Scottish oatcakes. They're dense, slightly nutty. Honestly, not bad with some butter. The wild part is these exact cakes still exist today. Walk into any Scottish grocery store and you'll find them. Same recipe, same purpose. 700 years of continuous survival food. But eels, now those were weird. People actually paid their rent with them. Eels were so common in medieval England that people paid their rent with them. Not joking. One manor in Cambridgeshire owed 60,000 eels every single year to their lord. That's not a typo. 60,000 slippery, wriggling fish as currency. Why eels? Well, these things were basically the cockroaches of medieval rivers. Impossible to get rid of. They filled every stream, pond, and marshy ditch in the country. And here's what made them perfect peasant food. Unlike regular fish that died the moment you pulled them from water, eels survived for hours on dry land. You could catch them in the morning and sell them alive at market that afternoon. No ice needed. No rush. Catching them required almost zero investment too. Peasants wove simple wicker traps called eel bucks from materials they found for free. Set them in the river overnight. Wake up to breakfast. The fatty flesh was the real prize though. During months when other foods offered nothing but empty bulk, eel fat provided genuine calories, energy you could actually use. Ely Cathedral. Its name literally translates to Eel Island. The entire region built its economy around these creatures. Smoked eel lasted months without any refrigeration. Families stashed it away for the hardest winter weeks when everything else ran out. But eels weren't the only overlooked food keeping peasants alive. There was another one hiding in plain sight, growing underground, waiting to be discovered. Before potatoes crossed the Atlantic, Europeans had to survive on something else. That something was the turnip. Not glamorous, not exciting, but absolutely essential. Here's what made turnips the ultimate peasant insurance policy. You could leave them right in the ground through early winter. Need dinner? Go dig one up. Snow on the ground? The turnip didn't care. It actually got sweeter after frost. And here's where it gets clever. Your wheat crop failed in June? Plant turnips. They grew fast enough to still produce food before winter hit. Basically, nature's backup generator. I'll be honest, I tried cooking turnips the old way once. Mash them with bacon fat. Not bad at all. Kind of like potatoes, but with a peppery kick that grows on you. But peasants didn't just eat the root. The greens went into soup. Even the flowers were edible in salads. One plant, zero waste. Medieval families couldn't afford to throw away anything, and turnips rewarded that mindset perfectly. Roman legions marched on turnips. Germanic tribes ate them. For over 2,000 years, this humble root kept European peasants alive when fancier foods failed. Then potatoes showed up from the New World and turnips became an afterthought. Funny how that works. The vegetable that fed civilizations for millennia gets replaced almost overnight. Speaking of grains that refuse to quit, barley might be the toughest survivor of all. Barley was the cockroach of medieval grains, and I mean that as a compliment. This stuff grew in soil so terrible that wheat took one look and said, absolutely not. Droughts that murdered other crops, barley shrugged and kept growing. Cold northern climates, no problem. Rocky hillsides where nothing should survive, barley thrived there too. Peasants figured out something clever. They'd boil barley into a thick, slightly cloudy drink that worked triple duty. Breakfast, medicine for stomach troubles, and hydration that actually filled you up. 1 cup of barley water and you weren't thinking about food for hours. Here's a fun fact that'll change how you see action movies. Roman gladiators ate primarily barley. Not steak, not some ancient protein shake. Barley. They were literally nicknamed hordearii, which translates to barley men. These guys, fighting lions and each other to the death, were basically running on peasant food. The bread was another story entirely. Dense, heavy, the kind of loaf that could double as a doorstop if needed, but remarkably sustaining. A small portion kept you going longer than twice as much wheat bread. Modern science actually explains why. Barley contains beta-glucan fiber, which we now know lowers cholesterol and keeps blood sugar stable. Medieval peasants had no clue about this. They just knew barley kept them alive when nothing else would. And the beer? That was basically liquid bread. Sometimes peasants drank more calories than they ate. Speaking of wasting nothing, the name garbage sounds disgusting, but it didn't mean trash back then. It meant giblets, organ meats, and scraps that weren't fancy enough for the Lord's table. Chicken feet, pig ears, fish heads, vegetable peelings. Everything went into one communal pot. Nothing was wasted. And I mean nothing. Here's what's funny. Modern hipster restaurants now charge $30 for nose-to-tail dining. They act like they invented it. Medieval peasants were doing this 700 years ago. They just called it Tuesday. The long simmering did something important. It pulled gelatin and minerals out of bones that would have otherwise gone to the dogs. Hours of cooking turned worthless scraps into something genuinely nutritious. And here's where it gets interesting. Wasting food wasn't just foolish back then. It was sinful. Throwing away edible scraps could literally be considered immoral. The church taught that waste was an offense against God. So peasants got creative, really creative. That tough bit of gristle, into the pot. Those wilted greens, absolutely. The water you boiled vegetables in, that's tomorrow's soup base. The wild part? You can buy artisanal bone broth today for $8 a cup. Same exact recipe, same technique. The only difference is fancy packaging and a food blogger's endorsement. These 15 dishes weren't glamorous. They weren't Instagram-worthy, but they kept millions of people alive through famines, wars, and winters that killed thousands. Sometimes the ugliest food tells the most beautiful story of human survival.